Sometimes, life has a quiet way of surprising us. A struggling single dad, an old barn collapsing in the middle of a storm, and buried beneath the rubble, letters from a century ago, carrying whispers of a love long forgotten. But what if those forgotten words opened the door to something more? What if, through loss and hard times, a man found not only a hidden legacy, but a chance at love with a woman from a world far beyond his own? This is a story about roots that run deep, hearts that heal, and how life always has room for second chances, if we're brave enough to look. If stories of kindness, hope, and unexpected love speak to your heart, why not subscribe to the channel? Come along with us. There's always room at the table for one more. Now, let's begin. The wind had always been a restless thing in Marigold Hollow. It whispered through the tall pines lining the edge of Micah Sullivan's farm, tugging at rusted hinges and loose shingles as if reminding him that time was the true master of all. But that afternoon, the wind howled like something feral, slamming against the side of the old barn with a force that felt personal. Micah stood on the front porch, squinting into the swirling gray sky, his hands, calloused from years of tending to broken fences and cracked soil, gripped the railing as he watched the barn sway unnervingly. The structure had been there for over a century, a tired relic of his family's once thriving orchard. Now, its weather-beaten wood groaned under the weight of storms past and present. "Dad, look!" Theo's voice rang out behind him. The boy, just 10 years old but with eyes too wise for his age, pointed toward the barn. Micah's stomach tightened. A crack sounded, sharp, splintering. Then, with a sound like the earth itself sighing, the roof caved inward. Dust and debris shot up in a cloud, pieces of the barn's skeleton collapsing into themselves. Micah felt an ache deep in his chest, as though some essential part of his family's history had been swallowed whole. Theo was already tugging at his sleeve. "Can we check it out, Dad? Maybe something survived?" Micah hesitated, glancing down at his son's hopeful face. It wasn't just the barn falling apart. He had felt like things had been crumbling inside him too, especially since Emily passed. Holding on to pieces of the past had been the only way he knew to keep going. He nodded, brushing dust from his jacket. "All right, but stay close." Together, they stepped carefully over shattered beams and broken boards. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and aged wood. Micah's boots crunched over the debris as he moved toward what had once been the storage loft. Theo darted ahead, stopping near a jagged hole in the floorboards. "Hey, there's something down here." Micah crouched beside him, brushing aside dirt to reveal a corner of what looked like an old wooden box, edges worn smooth by time. It was wedged beneath the collapsed beams, almost like the earth itself had been protecting it. With a grunt, he pried the box free. The latch gave way easily, revealing a stack of brittle, yellowed papers tied neatly with faded ribbon. His brows furrowed as he gently unfolded the top sheet. It was a letter. The ink had faded in places, but the words were unmistakably clear. "My dearest John, though the world insists we must remain apart, my heart refuses to let go. Someday, perhaps, what we've planted here will grow into something bigger than ourselves." Micah's throat tightened. John Sullivan, his great-grandfather, and the signature at the bottom, written in elegant, looping script, Evelyn Harrington. The Harrington name wasn't unfamiliar. Even in a sleepy town like Marigold Hollow, the Harrington family was legend. Old money, sprawling estates, and a fortune built on generations of influence. But what could a Harrington have had to do with his family's modest farm 100 years ago? He sifted through the rest of the papers, discovering more letters, some no longer legible, and beneath them, a folded, official-looking document stamped in wax. Micah unfolded it carefully, eyes widening. It was a deed, a joint ownership agreement between John Sullivan and Evelyn Harrington, outlining shared rights to a piece of land that sat right between his property and the neighboring estate now belonging to the Harringtons. Micah stood, the weight of the find pressing against him. Questions tangled in his mind. Why had no one ever mentioned this? Why had the agreement been buried, literally? Behind him, Theo was already peering toward the distant boundary line where overgrown brush marked the edge of the forgotten orchard. "Dad, do you think there's more?" the boy asked softly. Micah glanced back at the box, the letters, the crumbling barn around them. Somehow, he felt it in his bones. This wasn't just about old papers or a collapsed roof. It was about something larger, something unfinished, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something stir beneath the exhaustion and grief. A question, quiet but insistent. What if there's still something here worth saving? He ruffled Theo's hair, eyes fixed on the far line of trees. "Maybe there is, kiddo," he murmured. "Maybe there is." Micah sat at the worn kitchen table later that night, the house quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Theo had finally drifted off to sleep upstairs, but Micah's mind refused to settle. In front of him lay the fragile stack of letters and the brittle deed they'd unearthed from beneath the barn's ruin. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes scanning the faded ink once more. Each letter, though weathered, carried the unmistakable cadence of two souls writing not just to communicate, but to hold on to something forbidden, something precious. Words like "yours forever" and "a dream we can never name aloud" leapt from the pages, stirring something Micah couldn't quite place. His great-grandfather, John Sullivan, had always been a distant figure in family lore, spoken of as a hard-working man who built the orchard from scratch, surviving the Depression and dust storms. But nowhere in the tales his grandmother told was there mention of Evelyn Harrington, much less of a love story crossing lines of wealth and status. Micah traced the signature again. Evelyn Harrington. That name lingered. He'd heard it countless times growing up, whispered in the town's conversations like a relic of a bygone era. The Harrington estate still loomed beyond the hill, though no one had lived there regularly in years. Occasionally, rumors surfaced about the heiress, how she'd grown distant from her family legacy, how she'd built an empire of her own, far from the small-town gossip. He sighed, setting down the paper. There was something unsettling about it all. Why hide these letters? Why bury the deed? And why had no one in his family ever spoken of this connection? Before he could spiral further, soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. A moment later, Margot appeared, her silver hair gathered loosely at her neck, robe tied snug around her waist. "You're still up?" she asked gently, glancing at the table. Micah gave a small nod. "Couldn't sleep." Her eyes flicked to the scattered papers, and something shifted in her face. Not quite surprise, but recognition mixed with caution. She approached, pulling out the chair opposite him and sitting down without a word. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of decades seemed to press between them. Finally, Margot's fingers reached out, lightly brushing over the topmost letter. "These were in the barn?" Micah studied her. "You knew." A breath escaped her, quiet as the night wind. "I had suspicions," she admitted, voice low. "When I was a little girl, I remember finding my father reading these in the parlor. He told me they were private, something from long ago. I never saw them again after that." Micah leaned back, brow furrowed. Why didn't anyone talk about it? Margot's gaze softened, filled with something close to sorrow. Because, darling, in those days, a man like your great-grandfather falling for a Harrington woman wasn't just frowned upon. It was impossible. Different worlds, different expectations, and sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge them. She paused, tracing the edge of one letter almost absently. But they dreamed, she murmured. I think that orchard was their way of leaving something behind, something that might have outlasted the divide. Micah let the silence settle, heavy, but not suffocating. For the first time, he saw the threads of history stretching far beyond himself, layers of longing, of choices never made. There's more, he said, sliding the deed toward her. They were planning to share ownership of part of the land. It's official, signed by both of them. Margot's brows lifted, a spark of intrigue lighting her features. I'll be damned. Micah exhaled slowly. I don't know what to make of it. Should I just leave it alone? She looked at him, her voice warm but firm. Maybe it's not about what you should do, Micah. Maybe it's about what you need. That thought lingered long after Margot went back to bed. The next morning brought clear skies. The chaos of the storm reduced to damp earth and scattered debris. Micah spent hours with Theo clearing the barn wreckage, piling the salvageable wood to one side. Yet, the more he worked, the more his thoughts returned to the letters, to Evelyn's careful script, and John's determined promises. By midday, curiosity tugged at him like a persistent hand on his sleeve. The Harrington estate lay just beyond the next ridge, grand, imposing, its wrought iron gates often closed to outsiders. He hadn't driven past it in years, but something inside him whispered now was the time. After settling Theo with Margot, Micah cleaned up, folding the deed and one of the letters neatly into his jacket pocket. The truck rattled as he steered down the winding road, memories flickering with each familiar turn. When he reached the estate's entrance, he hesitated. The gates stood ajar, as if waiting. He drove slowly up the gravel path, heart thudding in a rhythm he couldn't quite steady. The house loomed large, yet there was a quiet stillness to it, as if time itself had paused, holding its breath. Micah parked, stepping out into the crisp air. He scanned the front steps, unsure who or what he expected to find. And then, as if summoned by his unspoken questions, the door opened. A woman appeared, slender and poised, her honey blonde hair catching the sunlight. She wore simple jeans and a cardigan, but there was something unmistakably sharp in her bearing, like a blade carefully sheathed. Their eyes met, and Micah's breath caught faintly. He knew instinctively who she was, though they'd never met. Genevieve Harrington, the descendant of the woman whose letters he now carried in his pocket. And just like that, the forgotten orchard no longer felt like history. It felt like the beginning of something stirring. Micah didn't usually get nervous. Years of repairing fences under threatening skies and raising a boy alone had taught him to stay grounded, steady. But as he stood at the foot of the grand front steps of the Harrington estate, something unsteady curled in his chest. The woman standing before him met his gaze without blinking. Up close, Genevieve Harrington was nothing like he imagined. No air of cold entitlement, no sign of the high society detachment he half expected. Instead, there was an alert sharpness in her pale blue eyes, like she'd spent years learning to read people before they spoke. She broke the silence first. I don't believe we've met, she said, voice smooth but edged with curiosity. I'm guessing you're not here by accident. Micah cleared his throat, shifting slightly. Micah Sullivan, I live just past the ridge. He gestured vaguely toward the direction of his farm, suddenly self-conscious of the worn jacket and dust still clinging to his boots. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face at the name, Sullivan, but she masked it almost immediately. "I heard there was activity over at the old barn," she said. "Did you come about that?" Micah hesitated. Then, pulling the folded paper from his jacket, he offered it wordlessly. She took it carefully, unfolding it. Her eyes scanned the faded ink, the legal jargon interwoven with two signatures at the bottom, John Sullivan and Evelyn Harrington. A long pause stretched between them. "This is real?" she asked, brows knitting slightly. "I found it under the barn after it collapsed, along with letters. Between my great-grandfather and—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Genevieve's fingers lingered at the edge of the document, knuckles white. She exhaled softly, a sound somewhere between disbelief and something heavier. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside. Micah hesitated but followed, boots echoing faintly against polished wood floors as he entered the Harrington estate for the first time in his life. The house smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil, but there was something hollow about the space, like no one had lived here properly in years. She led him to a sitting room that felt as though it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Heavy drapes, antique furniture, family portraits lining the walls. One painting in particular caught Micah's eye. A young woman, poised in profile, her expression serene, yet distant. "Evelyn?" he asked. Genevieve nodded, following his gaze. "My great-grandmother." She folded the deed, setting it gently on the coffee table before turning to face him fully. "Why did you come here, Mr. Sullivan?" He searched for an answer, realizing he wasn't entirely sure himself. Curiosity? Maybe something more. The letters had unsettled something in him, stirred a restlessness he hadn't felt in years. "I thought maybe you'd want to see this," he said simply. "They, our great-grandparents, were planning something, a shared orchard. For the town, it seemed." Genevieve crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "You think it matters now, after a century?" Her tone wasn't dismissive, but cautious, like she'd built up walls too high to let something as fragile as forgotten dreams reach her. Micah didn't flinch. Maybe not, but maybe unfinished things have a way of pulling us back, whether we like it or not. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Genevieve glanced back at the painting, the weight in her shoulders visible despite her composed exterior. "My mother used to talk about Evelyn," she admitted quietly. "Said she was the only Harrington with a heart big enough to see beyond herself. But none of that ever trickled down." Micah caught the undercurrent in her voice, the loneliness she didn't bother disguising. He shifted, hands in his pockets. "Look, I don't know what you want to do with this. I won't push, but I'm going to figure out what's on that land. Feels like someone should." Her eyes met his, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Then, after a pause, she nodded once. "Show me." Micah blinked. "What?" "Show me the letters. Show me the land." There was a firmness to her words that brooked no argument. Micah hesitated, unsure if he'd expected this to be the end of the conversation. But instead, it felt like something had cracked open. A door neither of them quite knew they'd been standing in front of. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow." She nodded again, folding the deed and handing it back to him carefully. "Tomorrow." As Micah walked back to his truck, the weight in his chest felt different, less heavy, more like anticipation. The puzzle pieces of history were still scattered, but something about Genevieve Harrington, sharp edges and guarded gaze, felt like she might just be holding the missing ones, and for the first time in years, as the wind rustled softly through the orchard's ghosted outline beyond the ridge, Micah felt a shift inside him. Something was waking up. Morning sunlight streamed through the bare branches as Micah stood at the edge of his property, eyes fixed on the line of tangled brush that marked the boundary. Beyond that, hidden under decades of overgrowth, lay the piece of land that had become the quiet center of his thoughts. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. A sleek, understated black SUV pulled to a stop near his old truck. Genevieve stepped out, dressed simply in jeans, boots, and a navy jacket, her blonde hair pulled back. She looked out of place amid the worn fences and peeling paint, yet strangely at ease. "Morning," Micah greeted, wiping his hands on his jeans. She nodded, expression neutral but eyes sharp. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd drive myself." Micah offered a faint smile. "Didn't figure you for the chauffeured type." A glimmer of something, humor maybe, flashed across her face before she turned her gaze toward the ridge. "You said the land is up there?" Micah gestured toward the thick underbrush. "It's not much to look at now. Overgrown, forgotten." They started walking, Theo trailing a few steps behind, curious but quiet. The path narrowed as they approached, branches tugging at their sleeves. Micah grabbed a fallen limb and tossed it aside. When they finally broke through, an odd hush settled over the space. The trees were wild here, unpruned, their gnarled trunks twisting skyward. Beneath them, the ground was littered with moss-covered stones and half-buried roots. It wasn't immediately clear where the orchard had once been, but the bones of it were here, if one looked closely enough. Genevieve stood still, scanning the landscape. "It's quiet." Micah nodded. "Too quiet, but you can feel it, can't you?" She didn't answer right away, but there was something in the way her gaze softened, as though she were piecing together invisible threads. Theo darted toward a low-hanging branch, fingers brushing against what remained of an old, weathered tag. "Dad, there's something written here." Micah crouched beside him, squinting at the faded letters etched into metal. "Baldwin Apple, 1921. He glanced up at Genevieve, who approached slowly, eyes fixed on the tag. "My grandmother used to talk about these," she murmured. "Said the orchard was the first thing Evelyn loved more than her family's money." Micah stood, wiping dirt from his hands. "Seems like they planted it together, but no one ever tended it after. Whatever happened?" Genevieve crossed her arms, staring at the tangled trees. "I doubt anyone even knew. My family didn't talk much about the past. Everything was always about appearances, legacy, control." Micah tilted his head. "Legacy's not always about control." She met his gaze briefly, something guarded flickering behind her eyes before she looked away. They walked in silence for a while, weaving between broken rows of forgotten trees. Micah pointed out the markers where the orchard lines used to run, bits of rusted fence poking through the undergrowth. When they reached a small clearing, he paused. Embedded in the earth was a weathered wooden bench, nearly swallowed by vines. He tugged at the greenery, revealing initials carved faintly into the wood. JS+EH. Genevieve crouched, fingertips grazing the letters. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Finally, she whispered, "I wonder if they ever sat here together, imagining something better than the lives they were supposed to live." Micah watched her carefully, sensing the unspoken weight behind the question. Maybe they did. Maybe it's still here, waiting. The breeze stirred around them, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and old wood. For the first time since arriving, Genevieve's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Do you think it's worth bringing back?" she asked suddenly, glancing at him. Micah didn't hesitate. I do, but it won't be easy. Her lips curled.